So today we're gonna discuss about Monolog, more exactly, what can Monolog help us to do better debugging and do better tracing. This button? Not? Okay. So there will be gonna be a slide about me, Magento logger, and then for topics, hacks that I want to show you, how to group logs by request, how to log something only when it's needed, a hack to discover memory issues, and what we can do when Magento for itself, it's called by another system or it calls other system, and to be able to do tracing around all the system at once. Okay, so this is me before starting to work on Magento 2 years ago. Okay, so this is the first presentation of mine that I'm not talking about performance and Black Friday. Innobyte, 18 years doing web development this year. Okay, so who is Magento 2 logger? Basically, Magento 2 logger is Monolog, as I said in the title of the presentation. So if it's Monolog, then we have access to a lot of features. So Monolog didn't invent the wheel. It's based on a logbook on Python, but there are other libraries that are working in the same way. A logger has a name, has some handlers, and then we discussed about other features. I will insist about that a logger has a name, and you will discover later why. Another thing that I've seen is that we developers in programming, we are using debug, info, maybe warning, and error, but there are 8, if I remember. The text is from the documentation, and it's good for you to know each level because then you can do other things without level. Boom. So we're gonna see some code later on. I discussed about that has multiple handlers. A handler is basically the class that is responsible to export the logs. What we are using mostly is file system, but Magento 2 in the core supports to forward the logs to the syslog if you are using Linux. And then if you have aggregation at syslog, then you have Magento 2 logs aggregation on multiple instances. You can send emails, you can log on databases, and there are other more. I can have a slide after. Then we have formatter, which by default is line formatter, what we know, but there are many others. And formatters are responsible to just do nicely things with the data that we pass to the logger. And then we have another thing which is called processor, which adds automatically data on the log information that we're trying to save. So most important handlers, we've seen file handlers, we have seen the syslog handler. Then there are multiple implementations to sending emails if something happens on the system. Then there are already built-in implementation, for example, to save the logs in Loggly, New Relic, and other 10 more systems. And for special handlers, what do I find most important? Just finger cross handler. I will have an example after a couple of slides, but the important thing on finger cross handler is that you can flush the logs only if at some point a specified level of logging has been reached. For example, critical, error, I don't know, emergency. And sampling handler why I do find nice is that on big website you can end up having a lot of data. By sampling it, you do find requests that have that error, but you don't have all the requests. Okay, for formatters, we have line formatters, HTML. If you want to send emails, I don't encourage you to send emails from logs, but I know, maybe you have to do something very quick. We have JSON formatter, which is very useful if we want, I don't know, parse the log files more easily than parsing text. And then JSON formatting can be used for logstash, loglib, and for syslog I already mentioned. So probably the most unused feature in Monolog is processors, because what I said at the beginning is that it can automatically add information on during log flushes. So we have, for example, the PCR log message formatter, which basically help us to do nicely formatted messages. We can monitor, for example, the load average of the processor. Maybe we can discover something strange there. Introspection processor is useful when, for example, you have to deal with something that is very special, payments, and you want to know from which line that text was triggered, because probably you can have the same log message written in different places. So you want to know exactly where the call was originated. We have memory usage and peak. I will show an example. Process ID and unit ID processor, I will have another example. Tag processor, for example, it can be used if you want to know that that log was written with a specific version of the application. So you can customize, you can set the logger, for example, to include the build number or the application version. And hostname processor is useful if you have multiple host names, multiple servers, and you want to, aggregate the logs at some point, and you want to know from which was originated. In the nutshell, we have to configure two things, right? When we want to create our own custom logger, we defined the class logger, which extends logger monolog, which extends monolog. And then we specify a name, which nobody does, even other implementation in the core. And then we decide the handlers, basically a file drive handler, and we specify the name of the file. Basically, this is what we are doing when we want to write something in the logs. And then we have this nicely log message. And now the question is, why do we represent those arrows? Because I don't know if you have questioned why the last brackets, what the last bracket means. So first is the logger name. Then we have the context, which we're going to discuss a little bit in the next slides. And then we have the extra parameters. And now, the first example I wanted to show. Something happened on the website. You get from the access log when the request started, but then you want to know from the top log file if the first line is corresponding with the first line on the system log file or the second one. Can you deduct easily if that was the order? And then we have the unit ID processor. What unit ID processor does is generates a unique ID. Basically, it's not unique, it's too short to be unique, but it's likely to be unique on each request. So if you identify a log that it's important for you, then you can search for that UID, and you can find all the logs that were written in that request. Yes, in this case, this file is from di.xml from the global scope, from the app folder. There are some loggers defined by some vendors that does not extend Magento framework logger Monolog. So you have to be sure that all the logs, if you want to implement this, all the logs classes have this processor. And probably you have noticed that in the first line, in the first log file, we have a different name after the date. And why is this important? Because if you aggregate all the log files from a Magento instance, or maybe multiple Magento instances, for example, in logstash, then you end up having all the information in the same place, in the same index. And probably you want to see all the warning that have been triggered on this channel, mid-Magento row.warning. So that's why it's so important to specify different names for each logger. Then, this is about finger cross. For example, I don't know if you have noticed this, that we are logging a lot of information only to have logged some data in case something happens. But what if we log only if something happens? So in this case, in this class, I have 2 loggers injected. It's not bad, but it's not pretty normal. I want for the mid-Magento logger to log hello event only if the place is different than Cluj-Napoca. So what I have done, I have defined it. Probably here is a typo. The first one is virtual type. It's not. No, it's actually type. It's not a bug in Monolog, but the finger cross handler from the Monolog does not have typing on the first parameter. So what I have done, I have created a class, finger cross handler, that extends the Monolog finger cross handler only to pass the first argument, which is the actual handler that is going to do the writing, even on file system or, I know, sending an email, or other things that you have seen at the beginning. The second argument, something that can be set on each handler, starting from which level you want to log on that stream, on that handler. In this case, I set error. And for finger cross handling, there is, I think, is the 4th argument, which says if at least error event has been triggered, write me anything but not the debug level. So you can specify where to start and what is the minimum level that should be included. And then I have passed the finger cross handler as a handler for my Monolog. And I don't have the image here, probably not. No, I don't have the image. Where we can use Monolog is to monitor system performance, system memory, or load. It's true that there are other tools available where you can do that, but this is something that you can easily configure. You just pass to processors, memory usage, and peak memory usage. And for example, probably in a loop, what Vali said, you might discover that the memory is going up because you are loading a lot of other objects. And the last thing is how to trace logs when multiple systems are involved. So what I have done, I will show you how is the magic behind it. In the first request, I specified the header X request ID with a custom value. The custom value in this scenario is when someone calls me, that probably generates the X request ID, the unique identifier of the trace. And in the second screen is when there is no one that calls other system that calls Magento. Is basically the user that enters on the site. So X request ID is not sent, and then the system generates a new request ID. In Monolog, we have web processor, which can handle this X request ID. So this is a log from the first request. Now, if that system tells me to, hey, send me all the logs for mid-Magento 2024, I can search for that string and give him all the logs that was generated by the application. To do that, my recommendation is to do at the first level of your application. In my case, now for this demo, is an Nginx. So in Nginx, we have the variable request ID, which is default in Nginx starting 1.10, I think, which generates a random number. So what I have done, I set my parameter, unique ID, which defaults to request ID, and if X request ID header is set, then I do the override. Big note to do, probably it's a good thing to do an IP address validation to allow only some system to be able to override this request ID. And then in the last line, I add in the response the value of the unique ID. The second thing you have to do in the Nginx is to pass this variable to the PHP FPM. This is a dev environment, that's why you have location PHP star PHP. And what happens is the result is what you've seen in the first logs. So what we can achieve now, you can have a unique ID header that can be passed, can be received from other system, but you can get this variable because it's a header and use it when doing other requests to other system. I know, payments, ARP, whatever. And then you can have all the trace from the starting point until the end. This end up be able to debug across multiple platforms. And another thing that to have is that if you do inspect the network traffic in your browser, you can see the request ID of that traffic, get the ID, and then search in the logs only for what happened in that request. Okay. Whew. So this is what you have learned today. What is Monolog? How to group log by request, to log only when something important happens. You can use it to discover memory issues and to trace logs between multiple applications. Thank you.